During the past almost a year and a half now, we all have had fewer opportunities to travel and also fewer opportunities to hear from our international colleagues. Right now, we're here to make the amends. Tomi, Cristina, and Tim will be our beacons of light for the next 45 minutes or so. But everyone in the audience has the opportunity to tune in also and ask questions from our speakers in Worksup platform. Feel free to post your questions in either Estonian or in English. To open the discussion, I am surrendering the virtual stage for a 5-minute introduction of his signals to Tomi, please.
Thank you, Martti, Aita, and greetings from northern Finland, from the city of Oulu. So my topic is about how to do youth work in the post-pandemic era. And if you look at what happened in Finland during the pandemic, you see this slide here. It's a combination of knowledge we have about how youth workers spend their time. Some of the municipal youth workers, they kept a diary called logbook, and based on logbook, we know what happened. So the orange column represents face-to-face youth work, and the blue column represents digital youth work. And it starts from January 2020. So yes, as you can see here, the first 2 months were done normally. So the main efforts were done on face-to-face youth work, and some digital youth work was done. And then Finland, like Estonia, started implementing lockdown measures in March 2020, and digital youth work started booming. And then during the summer, youth workers started to do face-to-face youth work again. And the number of digital youth work done went down until we started doing lockdown measures again. And the digital youth work was done more. So sometimes people in Finland say that youth work took a digileap and most of the youth work done was digital. But that isn't the case. Even in the pandemic era, the most youth work was done by actually meeting young people on physical space. And the use of digital youth work increased significantly, but it's still quite small compared to face-to-face youth work. So we need to pay attention to that. And we know something about young people in Finland. I think there are 5 key messages we need to be aware of. Sometimes people ask, is COVID crisis, is it a catastrophe? Is it a change, or is it a catalyst? And at least in Finland, it isn't a catastrophe, because majority of the young people are doing okay at the moment. And it isn't a change, because a lot of the young people say that COVID-19 crisis is not going to have a profound impact on their lives, but it will accelerate some of the societal disadvantages that we had before COVID-19. One of the things we need to learn in Finland, but also elsewhere, is the situation of young adults. So, according to our studies, those young people who are from age 12 to 14, they did quite okay in the COVID area, whereas young people in their 20s had a rough time. So we need to pay attention how to help the situation of so-called young adults. And COVID-19 was a period of loneliness. Some of the young people need peer support more. We need to think about those young people. And if I look at Finland, some of the young people think that COVID-19 era had a positive impact on their lives. Something that it's something that you get pass. So the impact is neutral. And for some of the young people, it will have negative impact. So if we are wise in Finland, we are able to analyze who are the young people who are most disadvantaged and find a way to help them. And also there are indications that violent behavior of the young has increased. So we need to do youth work youth work that would help us face those challenges. And what should youth workers do? I think there are a couple of key questions here that need to be answered. So I kind of changed the slide, so if you can help me. Yeah, well, it's working now. So there are 4 key questions that the youth work, at least in Finland, and I also suspect on the European scale needs to be able to answer. One is how to find the right balance between doing universal youth work, noticing that a lot of the young people, they're alone and they need their peer group. And there is that one group of young people who had a rough time, how to help those young people who had difficulties, how to do universal youth work. Finding a right balance is a key issue. We started doing digital youth work more on the European scale, on the Finnish scale, in Estonia probably as well. What can we learn from that digital leap, and how much we want to increase the use of digital youth work will be one of the things we will be discussing in a couple of more years. Also, coming out of the COVID crisis, we will do more multi-professional cooperation, and the youth workers need to find a way to fit in those structures. And one of the things youth workers need to be able to do is to say that young people, they need spaces where they can interact, because a lot of the attention is going to be on social problems. And lastly, this is a key European challenge. When we are coming out of the COVID crisis, the austerity measures will come up. People are going to ask, how do we use the social resources, the money that the municipalities and the state has? And in that period, we need to be clearly able to articulate what youth work is, what it stands for, and what good it does to society. So I thank you for your attention, and I will give room to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Tomi. Someone asked me this morning that are we doing our own little mini Eurovision? And it actually feels like that, because now we are traveling to Berlin. So Cristina, please, the stage is yours.
Super. Thank you so much. I regret to not have had prepared a better outfit for this occasion, but nonetheless, I'm happy to be here. From my perspective, looking at youth work specifically, but also youth policy and kind of our youth sector generally, one of the challenges that I think has arisen as a result of the pandemic is actually one which is perhaps one we don't really expect to be a challenge. And if I could get the next slide, my clicker is not working. And that is the growing volume of youth consultations. Now, of course, for all of us within the field, the concept of more youth participation, more youth voice, in terms of indecision making, in terms of shaping what we know about the situation of young people, is in so many ways an unqualified good. And we saw this even accelerate at a higher pace within and throughout the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide. In these cases, we saw, for example, the National Youth Agency out of the UK had tracked only within the span of 2020, 130 surveys that were carried out, of course, almost all online, with young people, asking them, tell us what you think, what are your experiences, what is happening with the COVID crisis, what do you anticipate for your future? And this 130 surveys were only those counting the surveys that included UK youth. We can also think of the additional surveys that were held in other languages, as well as also for European youth only on the continent. Of course, we have other modalities. We can think of the UNICEF U report, the European Youth Forum and ILO Youth and COVID-19 survey, which I was a part of the European version of that. And this also even had an aspect of consultation 1 year on. So not only are we asking young people within the height of the crisis, what are your experiences? We're trying to also follow up to see some change over time in these perspectives. UNESCO, Council of Europe as well, and a piece of research out of Queen's University, all of them focusing on this concept of talking to young people and getting to know what they think. This also is not even to mention the numerous Zoom focus group calls, the discussions that we're having with young people, the various one-on-one interviews. And so in so many ways, we're seeing this deluge of more consultation opportunities for young people because of this era-defining crisis that we've gone through. Next slide. So as I mentioned, of course, speaking more with young people, getting their thoughts, getting their ideas, for many of us in the field, this is an unqualified good. But I think we also do have to keep our eye on potential challenges with this. And I think that they roughly fall into three camps. I think we have a methodological challenge when it starts to come to us thinking about these various insights. There was no kind of consolidation in terms of what are we asking young people? How are we sampling? Not to say that this all needs to come from one place. Of course, we'll always have different surveys and sample groups and different approaches throughout. But when it comes for us just to simply make sense of what all of these young people are saying, how will we put that together to start to, have some idea in terms of some kind of concept of a realistic picture of what's happening to young people in this moment? And again, not a full obstacle, but something that is a challenge that we do need to think about methodologically for us researchers. Practically, I think we have a challenge with engaging so many young people at such a constant rate. I think that it's very clear that there is survey and Zoom fatigue for some of us researchers out there that are trying to reach out to groups of young people to participate in our surveys. I'm sure that over time you've also seen that simply the numbers are dwindling, and I think that is a clear indication that a lot of young people are spending more time online, but also an indication of perhaps are we asking young people the same questions? Are we reaching the same young people? Are they simply just tired of this type of exercise, which might start to feel extractive? And then also, lastly, strategic. Are we duplicating efforts within the community? Are we really thinking carefully about trying to understand different aspects of these experiences, different aspects of this crisis, or are we simply just replicating the same work? Are we also leveraging all of this information that we have? We have all of this this data now from young people, but are we really now using that data to really inform our policies, to conduct advocacy, to shape how decisions are being made? And I think that that's always part of the equation, which is perhaps missing when we think about what happens to the data from these surveys. So that's my input for a challenge for us to consider regarding the pandemic and young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristina. And now we're traveling 15,000 kilometers away to Melbourne, Australia. And Tim, I pose the biggest challenges of them all to you, to lead the good example by your fellow researchers and fit into your 5-minute introductory time frame. Please, the stage is yours, Tim.
Thank you, Martti. Thank you very much. Greetings from Australia, everybody. And thank you, Martti, for the invitation. I've always wanted to be on a version of Eurovision. And so this is now my great opportunity now that you've suggested that it looks like a Eurovision stage. So thank you. My topic is youth work and the well-being of young people during the pandemic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about recent research that's been undertaken with young people and that shows that personal well-being is strongly connected to community, and that isolation and lack of community connection have been primary concerns for young people during the pandemic and have contributed to anxiety and increased mental health outcomes. The other issue that we've seen has been the increased use of digital communication and social media, as Tomi has also referred to. This has been a good thing overall. However, young people report increased anxiety in relationship to their concern about overuse of digital communications and social media during the pandemic. Young people report being concerned about whether they're addicted to their social media platforms, they're addicted to their smartphones, and so on. So while digital communication has been useful for connecting people during the pandemic when they've been socially isolated, it's also increased anxiety. So how do we ameliorate this? During the pandemic, I undertook surveys with university students, and we interviewed 600 international students that from 44 different countries from around the world that were studying in Melbourne last year and experienced the enforced lockdown. We were locked down for the whole year. For nearly 4 months of that year, we were only allowed to leave our home for an hour a day, and we had to leave our homes for that hour on our own. We couldn't go outside with other people. So that enforced lockdown was very, very difficult for lots of people. And for international students particularly, they reported increased isolation because of language and cultural barriers, because many of them live in small unit apartments and don't know their neighbours. They're not connected into their local communities. The only people that they were socialising with were other students when they went on campus to the university. Because the university was closed, all universities in Victoria were closed for all of last year. In fact, they're still closed. I haven't been to the university for a year and a half. That increased young people's isolation, and their experience of isolation increased their anxiety and mental health issues. So one of the ways we tested was something called 5 Ways. And the 5 Ways is a public health messaging program that has been tested here in Melbourne through our Royal Melbourne Hospital. And we took the 5 Ways programs and we asked these international students, these 600 international students, about it and about the 5 Ways. We asked them whether connecting with others, being active and exercising, learning, being aware and mindful and helping others was important to them and to their health, to their well-being and to their mental health. They all responded in the affirmative. So we didn't have anybody that say that these 5 things were not useful. In fact, all of them responded very positively that they were very useful to them. We then asked them about how they might want to use these 5 ways to connect with others, to be active, to keep learning and to be aware, mindful and to help others. And so I've got lots of ideas that we can share about that, because one of the outcomes of this research is to suggest that these 5 ways to wellbeing, this evidence-based public health messaging, could be used as an activity base for youth work with young people during the pandemic and after the pandemic. Thanks, Marty. That's me.
Excellent. And may we have your 12 points, please? Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Tomi and Cristina. And now I hope you will all join me in a conversation. And the good thing is that already quite a few questions have been posted. So let's get started straight away. And I just throw out my own questions and start asking the ones that the audience have posed. So I think the first question goes particularly to Cristina, given your signal that you presented. And it asks, how has the pandemic influenced youth participation? There were situations where quick decisions were necessary. How well were young people involved in these situations?
I think that's a great question. With some organizations, for example, with the UN organizations that I work with, there was a feeling that what we needed to do was to engage young people more in this kind of emergency recovery mode. And in this sort of phase, right at the aftermath of a crisis, it was felt that young people were the participation of young people was almost its most important, because not only do we want to be able to involve young people in the decisions that are going to be made when we start to think about recovery and rehabilitation of our communities and our societies, but also because consulting young people in a mode of crisis is actually a way for them as well to feel like they have some retained control over their lives and to be able to support their well-being in that way. I think the question of if young people were still able to participate is still one which is up for discussion. Because of the nature of this crisis, all of the participation was limited to online. And so I think that's part of the reason why we see that so much of participation was really at the consultative level. It wasn't as much about other types of participation in terms of other higher forms of engagement, for example. And so we saw a lot of young people being asked what they think, in some ways as well being able to create different stories or media or blog posts, mostly from their rooms. In terms of political activation, young people really transferred a lot of their protests online. But I think that they were hindered. I think that it was really a challenge, and it will be something for us to consider as we go forward in terms of this reliance on digital when we have no other options.
Excellent. Tim, I know that you have experienced in your career many times defunding of youth work and youth services, dependent on which party of the two major parties in Australia has been in power. And there's a question relating for challenges for youth sector that are arising. As you all had also described, and at the same time we see the financial cuts for youth sector. What would be your words of wisdom? How could youth sector advocate better and how to make smart choices in these circumstances?
Thank you, Marty. That's a difficult question, but a very, very good one. Yes, in my 30 years in youth work, I have seen political parties come and go, and the policies of political parties change, and what they fund changes. This is a difficult thing. I think even with the best evidence and the best research, political parties will still make political decisions about what they fund, and often that's in the interests of the political party, and often about meeting the needs of particular constituencies that will vote for them. That's the realpolitik of our political systems and of democracy. So I think we do need to be smart about that. And certainly in the Australian context, I think it's important that youth organisations are representative of the broad constituencies that vote for political parties. I think that's different when quite difficult when there are conservative political parties or right-wing parties that are in power, and how youth organisations represent the interests of those voting constituencies, I think, can be very difficult. But I think it's important to try and do that. Important to try and do it in a way that enables organisations to continue to be funded, to be seen as representative, to not be seen as single issue groups, or to be on the fringe of political discourse. Does that mean that you have to agree with the political party that's in power? I don't think so. I think it means you can still be a critical friend, and that you're able to take opposing views. But I think if that's pushed to the extreme, where political parties feel that youth organisations are just their critics and don't provide usefulness or a service to their constituencies, that is, they only represent one group of young people and not all young people, then I think defunding is inevitable, and that's certainly my experience, which means that you end up on a cycle of being refunded when progressive governments come into power and then defunded when conservative or right-wing governments come into power. And I think this is a problem, and I think breaking down those barriers I think is the only way to survive, actually. Otherwise, be prepared to operate as a defunded organisation, to find funds elsewhere, philanthropic or through the community, and that may enable you to keep your critical voice. And that may be a choice that you have to make.
But can I just ask that,
Thank you.
What do you think, Tim? Has the pandemic actually created some new opportunities for youth work to showcase itself, and why it's actually needed, and what are the benefits? And if anyone else wants to jump in, then feel free.
Yes, I think so. I mean, for instance, this research on mental health that I've just undertaken in Australia, as a result of this, lots of organisations are very interested. There are, of course, other academics and organisations doing research on mental health, but the role of youth workers as a connector, we're referring to this idea of the youth worker as a boundary spanner. I don't know if that term resonates in Estonia, but this idea of the youth worker as a bridge builder, that they span and connect and allow young people to cross many bridges and connect with a whole range of services and activities, organisations, schools, welfare, recreation and sport and so on. They span and connect across these things and have become very important for young people, particularly in relation to mental health. Mental health is now seen as an epidemic in our context, increased by the pandemic. And so these areas of mental health, so social connection, reducing social isolation, has become an important role for a youth worker. And we know that building association, creating opportunities for young people to meet other young people is a part of youth work. We also know that recreational and sporting activities, exercise, is a part of youth work. We know that learning, informal learning, is a part of youth work. So those 5 ways that I listed are in fact all the things that youth workers do with young people. And they're now seen, certainly in the UK, in the policy context there, in Australia and other countries, are seen as preventative measures for mental health and early intervention measures for mental health. So taking those 5 ways is a way of saying, well, youth work does that, we already do that, and we do it with young people, involving young people in that process and involving young people in enabling them to create their own activities and so on, using these things that help to ameliorate, these 5 ways that help to ameliorate mental health. So the youth worker becomes the bridge builder, the boundary spanner, the connector. The other word that's being used is reticulist, reticulation. It's like enables the flowing of water. It enables the connecting of a range of things, as a way of supporting and enabling the young person. And I think more than ever in the context of the pandemic, the youth worker's role has been validated and is important. And it's the language that we use to communicate that to governments in relation to funding that becomes very important.
Thank you, Tim. And to continue on the very similar topic, then currently the most popular question asked by our audience on Worksup platform is, what is the biggest opportunity that the crisis has brought for youth work? And Tomi, do you have any ideas around that?
Well, I agree with Tim that really important thing is to communicate what Tim referred to as this is something we already do. So for us in Finland, there would be 2 things here. One is concentrating on peer relations and associations and relationships in general. So during the COVID area, we have been lonely, we have been in isolation, and they need the company of each other, and they understand them better than ever. So youth work has to be able to communicate that this is something we already do, and this is something we know really well. Now Finland, of course, is sometimes it's when we are talking in Europe, it's a bit of a depressing example because advocating for youth work is quite easy in Finland. But our government actually gave 7 million euros to promote school-based youth work, to make sure that every school concentrates on school well-being. And another thing has to do with targeted youth work, finding out those young people that have suffered from the COVID crisis and doing detached youth work. And I think if we are able to say that, they have decades of history of finding young people and encountering them and communicating with them and creating relationships with them, that has to be of value in the post-pandemic era.
So are you really saying that it is less of a choice now to make a clear decision or a clear choice between targeted and universal youth work, and we have more obligation to move towards targeted youth work, or at least put emphasis more on that, because as we know, it really varies country to country. Australia's approach to youth work historically, as has been UK's, has been more towards the targeted youth work and the historical underpinnings perhaps, and then our other countries such as Estonia, where we have practiced more the universal approach. So do you think that as a result of the pandemic now we should be seeing more emphasis being put on the targeted youth work approach, or what are your thoughts, just to elaborate more on your comments?
At least
Who are you
if I look
directing
at
that to,
Finland,
Martti?
yeah, but at least in Finland it will most likely happen. So we know that some young people are worse off. Of course, we are hoping that more money would come to youth work that way. But it's about finding the balance. I definitely don't want to lose the value of universal youth work. But already I see indications that a lot of my colleagues at the youth work management are trying to, to think how to do targeted youth work. So, and it might be a fair choice because the pandemic has clearly worsened the living conditions of a certain young, and working with them is a necessity. And I think there will be more pressures when they come out of the pandemic and start discussing about unemployment and mental health and violence and so on. But at the same time, we need to be prepared to say that, look, this is not the only thing that the youth workers do. And those young people that didn't suffer from the COVID crisis, they too have to have a right to, to have public spaces and to meet other young people and to enjoy the company of youth workers. So it's about finding a balance. I wouldn't call it either or. I wouldn't call it, a moderate shift towards perhaps the direction of targeted youth work.
Excellent. And Cristina, perhaps you would like to jump in, because we also have a very similar question or related question once again that asks about predictions and predictions around what will be the biggest change in youth work as a result of the crisis.
I think perhaps the biggest change is a bit of what Tomi had mentioned, which is both a change, but maybe not a change in the sense of digital youth work and more engagement online. I think that he had mentioned, for example, that of course face-to-face is actually still the main mode, and simply we see digital going up. And I think that that is actually aided by the fact that in our education sector, we had seen such disparities in terms of the rates of digitalization in our communities and in various countries, that a lot of investment was actually put into ensuring high-speed connection as well as devices to greater or lesser success, of course. But the idea that the pandemic and the online learning had accelerated digitalization in many of these communities, I think we'll also see that digital youth work will also become more popular. That's my prediction. And
take into account the changes that you already discussed and that we know that are waiting ahead of us. Some of those changes already have occurred. Some will be a bigger journey to adjust to. What then needs to change in the training of youth workers in order to be prepared to tackle the challenges brought about by the pandemic? Mental health obviously has been a very big topic brought about by the pandemic and the worsening situation around mental health in young people. Are there any other aspects and how to tackle them already in training and preparing new youth workers and obviously the existing ones in the field as well? If any of you would like to start, then please be my guest.
Do you want me to have a go at that, Martti?
Of course, Tim, please go ahead.
As a preamble, I just want to agree with Tomi that I think the tension between universal youth work and targeted youth work, I think is well, it's always been there, but I think it's more acute now. All young people are at risk, yeah? All young people have human rights, but those who are marginalised, those who are disadvantaged are at higher risk. And certainly that's been true in the pandemic. Though in Australia, the families where parents lost their jobs were in low-income households. Low-income households are overly represented with domestic violence, family violence and abuse and so on. So young people in these contexts are more at risk. So is targeting inevitable? Yes, it is. Does that mean we have to give up generic universal youth work? I don't think so. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think we need to do both. But that means that the training of youth workers becomes more complex. I think digital youth work, yes, that's obvious. Young people spend an enormous amount of their time in the digital space. But should we be uncritical of that space? No, I don't think so. Tomi and I have had recent conversations about this. As you know, Martti, I'm not on Facebook. That is my stand against surveillance capitalism. Don't use it. I don't like it as a platform. I'm critical of it, and I'm critical of the collection of data and the way that it's used and the way people are manipulated through that platform. So I think youth workers are going to have to be critical of social media platforms and the use of digital communication, not just benignly accepting it. I think that's really important. And I think the other one is trauma-informed practice. The use of trauma-informed practice as a framework for youth work, I think, is becoming more important. And understanding that young people's worlds are incredibly complex, and they bring those worlds with them into the youth work relationship and the youth work space. And it may not be that youth workers are therapists, and that's not what I'm saying. There are others that are trained in that way to do that work. But youth workers may be the bridge builders that enable young people to access the services that they need in relation to their childhood traumas and complex personal lives and so on.
The team stopped. So digital youth work, obviously, maybe working with young adults, but I would say multi-professional skills are needed. So to understand the service system, to understand what's the role of different service providers, and also referring to what Tim said about working with traumas. I think in the future it will be really important to know your barriers, where your skills and expertise ends, and there you need to leave room for psychologists or therapists or social workers and so on. And in order to do that, you need to have a lot of information on, in the context of Finland, how our service system works, who does what, where would you seek help, how do you contact different people, and so on. So being a bridge builder in the post-pandemic world will be, I think, slightly more difficult than it used to be.
Cristina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, just on that point, of course, digital youth work, and I had mentioned that myself before, but I think that Tim was absolutely correct in terms of being critical. I would say that perhaps, though, it's not critical in the sense of if it's happening or not, or if it should be used or not, but rather to be critical in the way in which we use it. Youth workers, if they are going to be engaging more in the digital space, will also need to know about privacy issues, about their own particular privacy rights, and also that of the young people that they're engaging with, and in their selection of software and other techniques. And I think that in a way, through the practice, we also have to think about youth workers themselves being digital citizens and being very critical of that. And I agree that so far our ideas of how we use digital within youth work is in some ways perhaps missing that aspect of it, in terms of us also being active, critical citizens in this new space and with these new tools.
Thank you for that. And of course, there is a question that really reflects on the hunger we have had to connect with our international peers and to learn from each other. And the question really asks about, based on what you know about the youth sector in Estonia, could you give us some feedback, reflections? How does that look to international stage? Even if some keywords and very subjective feelings and ideas would be interesting to hear using the opportunity that you are here with us today. And whoever would like to be first. Perhaps Tomi, as our closest neighbor?
Yeah, well, I'm always a bit hesitant to say to different people how they should do their job. One of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is the fact that sometimes when we talk about youth work and we talk about youth work strategies, we talk about really big stuff like mental health issues and non-formal education and learning and citizenship and so on. And those are clearly really important things. But sometimes we fail to mention that youth work is about having fun and it's about enjoyment. And sometimes we forget that fun is a serious business. And having fun is a serious commitment. So emphasizing the fact that we need to enjoy the company of each other's. And if youth work activities aren't fun for young people, the youth work isn't too good. So emphasizing that aspect is something that we in Finland tend to forget, and we need to remind ourselves that this is what youth work should be about. So whenever we are writing stuff, we need to keep in mind that.
Thank you for that. Tim, I know you always have a lot of ideas about Estonian youth work.
I think, Martti, one of the things that's always impressed me about Estonia has been citizenship education and the involvement of young people in the political process. And it's more advanced than it is in Australia, and it's more structural, and it's in the grassroots at municipal, local township level, right through into your national politics. And in a way that in the Australian context, that's not the case. Young people in Australia are quite disconnected from the political process, and their formal education and involvement in that is not great at all. So I think that's something that you should celebrate within your youth work and continue to encourage, as I think it's something really important. And particularly when you're concerned about political parties that will defund youth work, I think there's an opportunity for you to be active in encouraging young people to be part of the political process. So I think those things go together. And for some that may be dangerous, but I think that's an important role that youth work can play is in fact to empower young people's voices, to give them a voice in the political process. And I think because you have a lower voting age than other countries in Europe, certainly in Australia, and young people are already involved in the political system in a way that they aren't in other parts of the world, I think that's something that youth work in Estonia should cherish and encourage and facilitate to grow.
Excellent. Thanks for the words of encouragement, Tim. And Cristina, the last 60 seconds of your contribution, please.
Well, I have to say, unfortunately, I haven't had much opportunity to interact with Estonia or its youth sector, except from afar, which I think is a great shame. But I know, just as an observer and as a researcher, Estonia and digital youth work, again, coming back to the same topic, has always been on the cutting edge of that research. And I think that is hugely impressive. I think that it's something which is really a trailblazer within Europe in terms of the work that's going on there with respect to research and digitalization, which I think is super exciting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Tomi. Thank you, Cristina, particularly for the very short notice, Cristina, that you got to be here with us. And we really hope that the next conference or next opportunity we are having, that we can actually meet you in person and greet you here in Tallinn. So thank you so much, and we'll talk and meet again.